A very good evening to all the participants who are listening to me and who have joined in. I will be briefly speaking about various aspects of the Romantic period, about poetry, about a little bit about the thought that goes into it. I will also be talking about women romantic poets. In brief, I will be talking about a little bit about primary imagination, which is a very, very important idea. And I will be talking about the various influences that one sees when one is reading the literature of this particular period. Right. So, sorry, something happened and right. So I will begin first by trying to define what Romanticism is. And it is, of course, not possible to define what Romanticism is. On the other hand, what we could speak about when we talk about Romanticism could be a list of its characteristic features. So there is no way one could give you an exact definition of what Romanticism, romantic poetry, romantic literature is all about, what the essence of Romanticism. I could just give you that essence of Romanticism instead of giving you a definition. Because when I set out to give you a definition of Romanticism, all I can do is give you a list of its characteristic features. A very important critic, Mario Praz, when writing about Romanticism, notes that Romanticism, the essence of Romanticism comes to consist in that which cannot be described. Sorry, yes. So I will therefore try to give you a kind of an idea about what it is. The origin of this term, Romanticism, has been traced to the romances, the Middle English romances, and later on, it was subsequently used to describe anything that was exotic, anything that was wonderful. For instance, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, writing in his Biographia Literaria in 1817, says that his purpose in the lyrical ballads, which was published in 1798, was to write about persons and characters supernatural or at least romantic. So Coleridge is writing his literary biography, which is called Biographia Literaria in 1817. And among a number of things that he writes in this book, he writes about the origin, the genesis of the lyrical ballads, which was published in 1798, which contained, the first edition contained 19 poems by William Wordsworth and 4 poems by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a very slim volume of poems, which nevertheless was a very, very important work when it was published. And when he's talking about this particular work, he writes, he kind of uses the word romantic interchangeably with the word supernatural, thereby, pointing to the fact that this word could mean anything from exotic to wonderful and strange. Another very important critic of this, academic and critic, Marilyn Butler, she notes that, it's one, as I said at the beginning, it's impossible to define what Romanticism is. On the other hand, this is a term which is now used to describe a group of writers who were writing in the first quarter of the 19th century. What is very interesting is when they were writing, they did not think of themselves as the romantics, as the romantic poets. Instead, they were divided based on their literary belongings, based on their ideology, into several distinct groups. They were known by varied names. They were known as the Lakists, the Cockneys, the Scotsmen, and so on, depending upon the kind of ideology and the kind of locale and the kind of literary work that was seen in their literary qualities that were seen in their work. It was sometime in the middle of the 19th century when these people, these poets, were all gathered into one group and described as the English Romantics. And for a very long time, most of them, most books referred to, or the Romantic canon, included 6 major poets: Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and Southey. And this Romantic canon was sometime, became a canon sometime around 1940. I would here like to bring in something very important, particularly in the light of what we see here in the canon, and that is a reference to the fact that there had been innumerable women writers in the period. Though, the moment we say Romantic poetry, we think of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and till almost the beginning of the 21st century, or towards the end of the 20th century, people spoke mostly of the male poets. In recent times, one of the very important developments in Romantic studies has been with reference to these women poets, a rediscovery, a rereading of these women poets, a bringing these women poets into the Romantic canon, because these Romantic women poets are very, very important, very vital, very influential members of the Romantic literary community as we know it. My PowerPoint at this point of time gives you a list of some of these poets. And the female poets, mostly referred to as the Big Six, just as we refer to the Big Six when it comes to the male poets, are Anna Barbauld, Charlotte Smith, Mary Robinson, Hannah More, Anna Seward, and Helen Maria Williams. And these poets, during their lifetime, were extremely popular. They were actually much more popular than William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge or Keats or Shelley or anyone else. Mary Robinson was a contemporary of Wordsworth and Coleridge, and she was an extremely popular poet. However, unfortunately, at that point of time, the poet laureate could only be a man, and that's the reason it was Wordsworth. Apart from these names, these 6 names that I spoke about, my list gives you more names, as you can see, and here there are even more. So there are people like Joanna Bailey, who wrote plays as well, Anna Letitia Barbauld, Felicia Hemans, Letitia Elizabeth Landon, Mary Robinson I've referred to, about Mary Tighe. All of these were some of the most highly respected and widely read practitioners of poetry in the Romantic period. In fact, Felicia Hemans was a best-selling author of the 19th century, and Joanna Bailey was the foremost playwright of her time. And it is very interesting to see how all of them have been rediscovered. This work that I show right now on my screen, Romantic Women Poets, an anthology edited by Duncan Wu, is a very, very important work. I refer to it to show that this is one of those works which reframed the canon of Romantic poetry. There are quite a number of websites where you could actually access the work of almost all the major Romantic women poets as well. I would like to add at this point of time some facts about women writers at this point of time. And in terms of numbers, there were at least 500 women poets. And of the 3,378 novels published in these times, about 1,450 were identifiably female authors. And if we add dramatists, travel writers, philosophers, essayists, diarists, as well as innumerable women writers who wrote but did not publish, who maybe did not want to publish or were not comfortable with publishing, it does seem to be a very, very important period for women writers at this point of time. Some of the reasons for this, and I'll be talking a little bit more about these, is the changes in labor practices, because by this time, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. There are a lot of conversions and struggles around liberty and rights. And we have conversations about and struggles about liberty and rights, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. All of these gave some women an increased sense of possibility and opportunity for their lives. Moreover, as education and literacy increased, more readers emerged. As print culture expanded, writers capitalized on this area of growth in the economy. Copyright laws changed, so you have a new territory opening up for publishers and writers. Women authors were writing to meet the needs of the circulating libraries, which at this point of time became very, very important in the general ethos of England. Many of the authors at this point of time spoke about very important issues like women's rights. We have Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women written at this point of time. They spoke about democracy, about freedom, and many were trying to put in an effort to change for the better in the prevailing, to bring about a change in the prevailing social structures of the day. Almost all the writers that I referred to contributed to the discussion of women's rights, and they came from different backgrounds, had different experiences and perceptions, as well as different levels of education. So in other words, each of them brought their background, brought their education to present different ideas, different perceptions of what social improvement for women would look like. So this is a very, very important aspect of this period. These women writers impacted not only the writers of their own era, but they also looked forward, influenced major writers or major future generation of writers. Each of these writers made an effort to contribute to the society because they believed that they were speaking on behalf of women everywhere when it came to writing. So this is something I wanted to stress right at the beginning, because when we talk of romantic or romanticism and we look at the syllabus, it's mostly the male poets who find a presence out there. Romanticism, as I said, I'll be trying to give you a list of its characteristics. Romanticism is about the richness and fullness of life. Romanticism is about violence, about turbulence, about conflict, about chaos. But it is also about peace, about oneness with the great I am. It is about a harmony with the natural order, the music of the spheres, the dissolution in the all-containing spirit that is present all around us, where man, nature, and God are all linked up together. It is a thought. Romanticism is a thought which is associated primarily with a change in the direction of literature. Literature became less rational, more emotional, less urbanized, and with much more feeling for literature. This becomes the characteristic of writing at this point of time of romantic literature. Romanticism is also identified with a new interest in external nature, an interest in man, in the relation of man and God, a new interest in the human soul, and also, interestingly, in cultures remote spatially and temporally, the older cultures, the ones which are far off from England at this point of time. This period in Europe, the late 18th century in Europe, was an age of transition. A number of things were happening which are going to, or which brought about a lot of changes in the world. Industrialization has already begun. So with industrialization comes modernization. Democracy has become an important idea. We notice a number of political events happening. The French Revolution of 1789, the nationalist movements in Italy, Germany, Greece, all of these contributed to altering society and human relationships. Many of the romantic poets, many of the poets we read were, went to France, saw the revolution from very close quarters, saw the positive of the revolution and then the disillusionment as well. So this particular moment, this particular time in the history of Europe is a period of great intellectual and political activity. And it is a period when the world is undergoing a lot of transition, which provided the fertile ground for these writers to write. This particular idea also challenges or makes amends to the widely accepted idea that Romantic literature began with William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's publication of the lyrical ballad in 1798. That's what has been used to be thought, that it begins with 1798, but that is not the case. Why, I tell you? Because what we now describe as typical Romantic traits were already present in the work of the Augustan poets, the poets coming before this, the period before this, which the period that we call the neoclassical or the Augustan period. Contrasted, generally, this is what we think, that contrasted with Romantic emphasis on emotion, feeling, and imagination, the neoclassicism of the earlier age, of the Augustan age, stressed on order, harmony, and rationalism. That is how we describe the neoclassical age, an age of prose, reason, and common sense. However, what needs to be mentioned is that Romanticism is not just a reaction to some of the tendencies of the 18th century, but it is also an outgrowth of it. So it is not as if Romanticism is completely opposite to that, to the 18th century ideas, but a number of ideas which were prevalent in the 18th century, one can notice them in the Romantic period also. I'll just give you a few examples. The transition towards this new way of thought begins with this particular work called, this is first witnessed in the 18th century, and one sees this in works like Night Thoughts by Edward Young, which was published in 1742, and Mark Akenside's Pleasures of the Imagination, which was published in 1745. So mid-18th century works, we notice in these works, which are predominantly belonging to the Enlightenment period. However, we do find in these works references to new ideas which stress on imagination. Similar ideas are also present in Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, and Gray is supposed to be a precursor of Romanticism. This poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, was published in 1751. And this poem talks about the ephemeral quality of human life with its evocation of very somber grave scenes. And this moralizing tendency, this tendency to moralize, is not particular to poetry alone. It is also seen in the novels of Samuel Richardson, who was writing in the 18th century. A work of importance in any consideration of Romanticism is Young's Conjectures on Original Composition. And my slide gives you a quotation from that, which I will be reading because this is a very important quotation, because many of the ideas now which we refer to as romantic can be found in this work. And this is what Young writes. An original may be said to be of a vegetable nature. It rises spontaneously from the vital root of genius. It grows and is not made. Imitations are often a sort of manufacture wrought by those mechanics, art, and labor out of pre-existing materials, not their own. What Edward Young's quotation, the reason I bring it here is that Young's quotation brings in two very, very important ideas. The idea of originality and the idea of spontaneity. Both ideas are very, very important to Romantic aesthetics. He speaks of the original, and there is another idea which he also brings in here, and that is the idea of the organic. An original, he says, may be of a vegetable nature. So it's like you plant a seed, and then after a few days, you care for it, water it, and after a few days, the seed, it blooms into a plant. So it comes from within. It rises spontaneously as a very organic part, as a part of an organic process. It rises spontaneously from the vital root of genius. It grows and it is not made. Opposed to this is imitation, where something is created by using mechanics, by using art, by using labor, out of pre-existing materials, things which are there, which do not come from within. The notions of originality and spontaneity, as I said, are seen here in this quotation. And it is this idea of imagination which becomes the standard hallmark of Romanticism. Right? It makes its appearance out here. And this idea of imagination also forges a kind of link between the Enlightenment and the Romantic age. So my point is that, we usually tend to see both these ages as completely opposed to one another. But what I'm trying to tell you is that a number of ideas which we think of quintessentially romantic are already present in the 18th century. The Cartesian philosophy of the earlier times was responsible for rupturing the link between man and nature, resulting in a dualism which was aided and abetted by the mechanistic philosophy. Imagination holds the hope for reconciliation. Imagination speaks about synthesis. It speaks about the coming together of man's spirit and the reality of nature. And this idea of imagination, which began in the Enlightenment, reaches its culmination in the Romantic period. It reaches its culmination in Romanticism, bringing in a new notion of thought and art, which one sees even today. So this in-between stage, we call it the pre-Romantic period, when we have poets like Robert Burns, Gray, William Blake writing. Why? Because these ideas at that point of time were merely trends of thought. The idea of imagination, the interest in external nature, the idea of sensibility, and the emphasis on genius. These ideas, the Romantic poets took up. By the end of the 19th century, they took up this particular, by the end of the 18th century, they took up these ideas and gave to imagination the status of the most important idea. So imagination becomes the hallmark of Romantic literature. The literature of, I just would like to bring in a little bit of Germany in here, because Germany was a very, German thought and philosophy was a very important influence on Romantic thought. The literature of the period in Germany that was a great influence was called the Sturm und Drang movement, storm and pressure, roughly. And this literature was one of protest, one of revolution. This period in Germany is characterized as the age of the genius. Why? Because in this period, there was a lot of emphasis laid on the importance of the exceptional man, the genius, a person whose achievements and experience were unique, a person who was able to bring together various elements which he could transform and transfigure by using what was called the modifying colors of imagination into a creative work. So these ideas, the importance of imagination, the belief in the inspired genius, the primacy of intuitive spontaneous feeling, freedom of expression, the idea of organic growth, which resulted in an interest in the Middle Ages, and a new vision of nature as part of a larger universe. These features of the Sturm und Drang movement in Germany later became key concepts of Romanticism. One needs to know that though England received its stimulus from Germany, most of the ideas had their origin on English soil. Beginning in the 1790s, these ideas infiltrated into England through the medium of literature. English Romanticism, we also have German Romanticism and French Romanticism. However, English Romanticism is less systematic and less self-conscious than German or French Romanticism. While the literary people in France and Germany had to follow and outdo their glorious predecessors, the English Romantics were conscious of representing a new beginning. when the Lyrical Ballads was published in the first edition in 1798, this had an advertisement where Wordsworth mentions the fact that these poems were experiments. He's conscious of the fact that this kind of poetry that he's presenting in this work is something which is new, something which hitherto had not been known till now. So, Romanticism, therefore, as we notice, is not one single intellectual movement, but a complex of responses to certain conditions which Western society had experienced and continues to experience since the middle of the 18th century. However, in its primary manifestation, if I can in a nutshell explain or define Romanticism, I would say that it marks a shift in the nature of man, in nature and in the cosmos. Also, Romanticism signals a change in the nature and function of the artist and the relation between the artist and his audience. So in Romanticism, in this period, the artist becomes very, very important. In the preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1802, William Wordsworth writes that a poet is a man speaking to men. So the function of the poet, the role of the poet, the nature of the poet becomes important. The artist is very, very important. So the artist is writing because the artist feels the urge of communicating. A poet is writing a poem because the poet wants to write the poem, not because someone else is telling him to write the poem. The poet will write about expressions, ideas which the poet wants to express. So in the whole scenario, the artist is most important, not the audience. You may like my poem, you may not like my poem. But I am writing the poem because I feel the urge to express myself. I'm speaking about this because this is a change from the earlier 18th century, from the neoclassical or Augustan period, where the audience is the most important, not the writer, not the poet, which is why Augustan literature is so very didactic. Why you have so much of satire, because the poet wants to tell you something, wants to teach a lesson, wants to convey a message. But by the time you come to the Romantic poet, this relation between the artist and the audience has changed. The Enlightenment period was also a period which was committed to change and development. This is the period, as I told you, when the Industrial Revolution has already begun. So human beings are working in tandem with the forces of external nature, and human beings have the power to change the course of events. A change that was to be achieved through the free and uninhibited exercise of reason and sense. So in the 18th century, human beings could do things to manipulate, to work their way around. By the time you come to the Romantic period, Romanticism changes this perspective. How? The Romantic world is a world in which nature plays an important role. Nature is seen as having great control over man, manipulating him, infusing him with energy and desire. And this shift in perspective is evident in different approaches to nature, which you see in the paintings of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. I will just briefly refer to a couple of paintings, which I think, because I think they are very important to understand the period. And I will be referring to Constable and Turner, two very important, John Constable and Turner, two very important painters. Constable's paintings of the Suffolk landscape evoke pictures of the Golden Age. I just refer to two paintings, the Cornfield and the Hay Vane. And both of these paintings are perfect pictures of tranquility. The rural scene in the cornfield depicts, the cornfield is here, this is the painting. The rural scene in the cornfield depicts what appears to be an ordinary beautiful day on the farm. There are white clouds over, and behind There is an abundance of majestic trees paving the entrance to the farmer's cornfield. In the painting, there is a diligent tiny dog who herds an obedient flock of sheep, while a young boy who appears to be taking a break from his laborious chores drinks water from a glittering stream. So there seems to be a lot of order here. And the various hues of fading greens and browns that John Constable uses implies that the time of the painting is the end of summer, thereby leaving a lingering sensory effect on the viewer. In the other poem, in the other painting called the Hayway, Constable chooses to paint a rural landscape which runs into the distance, with the sun shining beautifully across these meadows, offset by the cool waters of the pool in the foreground. The theme of this painting is very much rural life and the beauty of the landscape, which the artist himself liked a lot. So there seems to be a tranquility all over. In contrast to these evocations of serenity and tranquility that you notice in these paintings are the paintings of Turner. I will just show you two, one called Rain, Stream and Speeds, and the other called Rockets and Blue Lights. And what you notice in these two paintings is that here you notice nature not in its tranquility, but nature in its fury. Nature revealing its energy, threatening, destroying. Turner is someone who frequently paints scenes of contemporary life. He was also interested particularly in industry and technology. As he often used new forms of transport, the steam was discovered at this point of time, the steam engine comes in. So he himself used steam engines, and his paintings show that. You can see that steam engine moving up. His painting is not a rejection of modernity. Instead, he saw both the train and the bridge as subjects worthy of being painted in this painting called Rain, Stream and Speed. Turner's paintings is not about things. It's not about the sea. It's not about the ship or the whales, but about light, about energy, about the unseen forces of nature. You see, there's so much of turbulence all around. And in this romantic period, it is this turbulence that you find poets and writers drawn to. So Romanticism, as I told you briefly earlier on, is also associated with the cult of the individual personality. The individual is very, very important. The artist is very, very important. The artist becomes the medium through which nature's purposes are achieved. The romantic artist also at times took on the function and character of a seer, of a prophet, of a visionary. He is at times subject to inspiration. Hence, the ideas of discipline, rationality, prudence, control, which are so much associated with the Enlightenment, with the 18th century neoclassical age, gives way to spontaneity and originality. Along with this idea of spontaneity comes in something else, and that is the Enlightenment literature is characterized by a sense of completeness, a sense of closure. In contrast, Romantic literature is essentially open-ended and hence can be read and comprehended in a broader context. One also notices that in this period, Romantic literature is also characterized by a large number of unfinished and incomplete poems by writers of this period. The fragment was also a very, very important form of poetry. And this tendency is not peculiar to literature alone. It is evident in painting and in music too. We have the sketch, we have the short lyrical poems. The change in the role and position of the artist and the work of art involved a change in the relation, as I noted earlier, between the artist and the audience. The Enlightenment artist was a teacher addressing an audience. The Romantics pushed back the audience and the reader to a passive role. The artist was of primary importance. I will now move on to talk a little bit about science. You know, when we talk about the Romantic period, we usually say that imagination is important. And when we think of science, science is something which is based on facts. Science is something which is based on reason. So we kind of tend to think of science as opposite to imagination. But what is interesting to note is that the poets of this time are all, not just the poets, all writers, or Romanticism itself engaged with a lot of science and scientific achievements. Yes, there were many who distrusted science. For instance, William Blake, he was one of those who rejected science completely. However, there were poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, like Percy B.C. Shelley, among the Romantics, who were greatly interested in scientific phenomena, who were greatly interested in the developments in science. For instance, Coleridge was very much interested in chemistry. In a letter written in 1800, Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes, "I shall attack chemistry like a shark." Attack meaning here he would like to engage. Chemistry revealed to Coleridge the relation between things apparently different. And he uses this to speak about this in one of his prose works called The Friend. So he says, you know, just as Shakespeare in his works brings so many diverse ideas to create these characters who are so very different from one another, he brings all his thoughts, modifies them, transforms them to create something. In a similar way, he says, water and flame, the diamond, the charcoal, and the mantling champagne with its ebullient sparkles are convoked and fraternized by the theory of the chemist. You see, diamond and charcoal both are carbon. But you see, they're so different from one another. This is, in truth, the first charm of chemistry. The charm of chemistry lay in the fact that the most universal interest was excited by its discovery. So chemistry taught Coleridge that there is a sense of principle in everything. And this sense of principle that one sees when we associate things in our mind, when we talk about connections in our mind, when we talk about the correspondency of nature, we see that also in chemistry doing that as well. So chemistry, like poetry, revealed an underlying unity which is not immediately apparent. Not only Coleridge, but Shelley, he loved science. And he's never tired of expressing in poetry the thoughts which science suggests to him. Science for him symbolizes joy, peace, illumination. What the hills were to the youth of Wordsworth, a chemical laboratory was to Coleridge, was to Shelley. So the Romantic poets, when they spoke against science, when they rebelled against science, they were not rebelling against science itself, but the mechanistic model of life that it afforded. One reason why they were very interested in science is that the Romantic artist, like the scientist, was working to bring together various natural phenomena into one place, weave it together with experience. John Keats' famous 1816 sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, in this sonnet, he celebrates the discovery of Uranus, the first new planet to be found in more than 1,000 years. In 1781, the amateur astronomer William Herschel had discovered Uranus, the seventh planet. And Keats speaks about it in his poem. Humphrey Davy, the scientist, Humphrey Davy was a very close friend of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Humphrey Davy invented the miner's lamp, so that when there was poisonous gases in the mines, the miners could be warned about it. He also measured the cubic capacity of his own lungs. Davy also experimented with gases, including carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide laughing gas. Humphrey Davy's very close friend was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who attended almost all of Davy's lectures on science. Not only that, Coleridge was also one of the people upon whom Humphrey Davy experimented with laughing gas or nitrous oxide. Laughing gas or nitrous oxide is important because it was used as an anesthetic. It was used in anesthesia at this point of time. And Humphrey Davy, the father of modern chemistry, was someone who was very, very important at this point of time. Davy became the director of the Pneumatic Institution in Bristol. And here in Bristol, he formed friendships with this group of young literary men who shared his love of nature and poetry, including, as I said, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Southey, and the publisher Joseph Cotton. As I also noted, Coleridge was one of the people upon whom he participated in many of Davy's experiments. Davy also studied galvanism. He invented electrochemical analysis. And galvanism, electricity is something very, very important because you see them being used by Mary Shelley when she writes Frankenstein. Humphrey Davy had also been the president of the Royal Society, and not only that, Humphrey Davy was also a poet. He wrote poetry, and his poems were published in the annual anthology edited by Robert Southey. In the revised version of the very long and very important poem, The Prelude, William Wordsworth talks about Isaac Newton. And this is what he says, and from my pillow, looking forth by light of moon or favoring stars, I could behold the antechapel where the statue stood of Newton, with his prism and his silent face, the marble index of a mind forever, voyaging through strange seas of thought alone. Like the poet, the scientist also worked alone. Wordsworth is describing his visit to Cambridge, where Wordsworth studied for some time and where Isaac Newton also studied and worked. Wordsworth believed that poets and scientists should work together through the known and the unknown, working to reveal the mysteries of the universe. So, imitation and reason, therefore, important aspects of the earlier mechanistic philosophy of the 18th century, gave way to inspiration, which best reveals its power in poetry. The Romantics considered poetry as the spring of higher truths. And this belief is also linked with a change in the language of poetry as well. As the mechanistic philosophy gave way to organicism, the belief in the relation between reason and nature, between knowledge and ordinary prose, also gave way to a symbolic language. The truths of poetry could only be expressed using the special powers of imagination. And this emphasis on the importance of imagination led quite inevitably to the fascination with dreams, supernatural phenomena, and also to a preference for such genres as romances, stories with supernatural incidents and characters. In the New World Order, as I noted earlier, individualism assumed great importance. And it is this which characterizes the Romantic outlook. The older ideas of oneness and integration gave way to the regard for the rights and rights and the feelings of the individual. And this is seen in a large number of autobiographies which were written during this period. The Romantic poets, the Romantic writers rejected the external social order and reason. Instead, they turned inwards into the soul of the individual. Evidence of this is seen in the interest in psychology and the inner senses. And this interest in psychology and in different types of psychological theory led the Romantics to explore and use images and metaphors which convey the goings on in the human mind. So they were concerned also with what is happening within the mind. Remember, psychology as a branch of learning did not yet begin. The Romantic writer is concerned not with things as they are, but as they appear to him. And this therefore suggests the importance that they attached to the idea of imagination. And imagination, as all of you know very well, is something, an important, very, very important idea. Imagination is the means of perception. It is not just the faculty of creating images, it is the power of going beyond the external reality of the images, of going into the heart of those images to conjure up something different, something unique. And of course, my slide shows fancy, imagination. These are with reference to Coleridge, what Coleridge had to say, where he distinguishes between the fancy and the imagination. And he also goes on to distinguish between two different kinds of imagination. One, the primary imagination, and the second, which is called the secondary or the poetic imagination. Fancy is whatever you see outside. You look outside, you see a cat, and you describe it to someone. That's fancy. It combines what it perceives into beautiful shapes. Imagination brings together, fuses, unifies. So imagination is the power of receiving impressions of the external world through the senses. So you go somewhere, you see certain things, and you come back to describe it all. You bring back some of the feeling as well. The secondary or the poetic imagination is what distinguishes a poet or a creative writer from ordinary people. Why? It is a shaping and modifying power which dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to create. It brings together varied ideas, so vastly different from one another, and fuses them in such a way that the end product is something completely different, completely unique. It goes into the heart of these images, which all of us see, but we don't find these links between the images and thoughts. And that is what the secondary imagination does. And secondary imagination is what the poet has, the poetic imagination. It is what distinguishes a poet or a creative writer from ordinary people. That the Romantic poets were concerned with imagination, with states of mind and other phenomena not rationally explicable, does not suggest, even for once, that they were escaping from reality. So just because they are so much into imagination, supernatural, and all of this does not mean they were not aware of the reality or that they were escaping from reality. No. On the other hand, the English Romantics were very much involved in the realities of their age, in the revolutionary climate of their time. One notices it in their poetry and political and social commentary as well. This period also was characterized by an increase in the importance of trade and industrialization. I did speak about industrialization earlier, but it also is an important period when trade also has begun. The period also was marked by an increase in imperialism, with the imperial activity spreading out to the Eastern Hemisphere as well. And this is a period which sees an increase in colonial expansion. You see, the English have already arrived in India by this time. Much before this time, they're already there. There have been critics and academics who have read the theme of the rhyme of the ancient mariner as an expression of maritime expansion and have interpreted the guilt of the ancient mariner as the guilt of the European powers because they have ill-treated the people in the colonies. And such a reading adds to an understanding of the nature of imperial policies. The very important aspect of this maritime and this colonial expansion was the issue of slave trade. And many of the romantics wrote about this aspect. Hannah More wrote a long poem called Slavery for the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in support of one of William Wilberforce's attempts to get an abolition bill through Parliament. So here you have the poet writing a poem to speak against slave trade, to argue for the abolition of slave trade so that this abolition bill is passed through Parliament. So you see, they were socially and politically very active, very aware of what's happening around them. As I told you earlier on, Romanticism is an expression of a division between self and body, self and society, body and soul. The romantic poet questions, the romantic poet explores various possibilities of belief before he or she can arrive at a particular one. And romantic poetry involves a structuring and a restructuring of traditional ideas about what poetry should offer. This is the reason why romantic poets often refer to their poems as experiments. In the advertisement to the 1798 lyrical ballads, as I said, Wordsworth writes, the majority of the following poems are considered as experiments. And this is something that many of the poets were doing. So romantic poetry questions, but the poems do not present any solution. The reader is invited to join in the very experience of deciphering along with the poet. Hence, much of the poetry is open-ended. It attempts to disrupt the reader's sense of order and structure and leads the reader to an underlying world of disordered data. To arrive at a final grasp of the experience depicted and the doctrine it attests, the unstructured data needs to be explored. So we could say that, therefore, Romanticism has abundant imagery, abundant quality of natural objects, the theme of imagination linked closely to the theme of nature. Two very important ideas, the idea of organicism, the idea of the symbol. Imagination for the view of poetry, nature for the view of the world, and symbol and myth for poetic style. These could be described as the most important ideas that characterize Romanticism. All romantic poets conceived of nature as an organic whole. And all romantic poets are mythopoeic, are symbolists. One of the concerns that one notices in romantic poetry is that these poets try to maintain, or these writers try to maintain, something of the interactive unity of the self and life. The romantic poets speak about wholeness, about unity. They would like to see things as a whole. And this accounts for the presence in romantic poetry of figures of isolation and loneliness, like the wandering Jew, who often appears in the guise of Cain or the ancient mariner. These lonely figures are wanderers, cast off from the normal humdrum of life. They are doomed to live, and as their knowledge increases, so does their isolation. I will now move on to talk about a few of the romantic poems, very few in very briefly. And after I finish, if you have questions, I'm more than willing to take them up. These are, I begin with Lamb, whose two poems, The Tiger and the Lamb, from the Songs of Experience and the Songs of Innocence, provide two contrary views of creation. Both poems talk about the creation of the subject, and both of them offer different perspectives about the nature of creation and goodness. The poems also differ in their structures. While both of them have simple rhyme schemes, one notices repetition and diction, and the diction used in the Lamb to be much more childlike, while the language in the poem The Tiger evokes more sinister imagery. Both poems mirror one another in the fact that both have a number of questions. In the Lamb, the question, there are very innocent questions are asked. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? A similar question in the Tiger as to who created the tiger, but you notice the way in which it is presented. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? There is no innocence out here. In its place, we have experience. The Lamb offers a direct answer. Who made thee? God. The answer in the poem The Tiger is unclear. There are doubts. Did he who made the lamb make thee? Both the poems struggle to reconcile. These two poems, we read them together. They are meant to be read together because one is able to reconcile the fearsomeness of the tiger with the innocence of the lamb, questioning whether the same maker could be responsible for two such vastly different creations. The tiger is also full of references to rebellion, to Satan's revolt in Paradise Lost. The stars threw down their spears, he writes. To Prometheus, and Prometheus was a very favorite rebel of the Romantics. What the hand dare seize the fire, reference to Prometheus. And to the figure of Icarus, on what wings dare he aspire? And these images have led many critics to see the tiger as a metaphor for revolution. In his poem, The Prelude, Wordsworth describes post-revolutionary Paris as, and I quote, a place of fear, defenseless as a wood where tigers roam. The tiger, a powerful, unpredictable, gorgeous, but deadly, becomes a potent image for what later on W.B. Yeats would call the terrible beauty of revolution. Another very important aspect of Blake's metaphor in the poem The Tiger is who made the tiger. And the tiger owes its existence to a combination of human labor and industrial processes. Stanza 3 of the poem focuses on the human effort, the shoulder, and the art which twists the sinews of thy heart. In the next stanza, the poet conceives of the tiger's creation in terms of industry. He uses a number of metonyms for the blacksmith's forge, hammer, chain, furnace, anvil. This particular stanza has undeniable energy and a fascination with what industry can produce, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp. It is interesting that both the worker and the tiger are represented by a strange combination of body parts: shoulder, heart, sinews, hand, feet, brain. And I think one could draw a parallel between this and with the creature that Frankenstein constructs in his workshop, a workshop of filthy creation in Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. Another text which draws upon both Paradise Lost and the Prometheus myth, asking questions about who makes us. Using technology and science, speaking of the great advances of science, reversing the creation myth. Because here you have a man creating another human being. And using science, using galvanism, using electricity. So it's very interesting to see how technology, how science comes in these works. The next poem that I would like to refer to is Kubla Khan. The poem falls into two distinct sections. And the first section deals specifically with the description of the landscape and what Kubla Khan is going to do. The preface to the poem, however, shifts the focus of the poem to the poet's experience, the process of the composition, and the failure to complete it. This preface was added much later. In the preface, he writes that he had been reading this work by Samuel Purchas called Purchas' Pilgrimage, and he falls asleep. And in his sleep, he has a dream. And the moment he wakes up from the dream, he begins to write it down. As he's writing, a man from the neighboring village of Porlock comes on some business. And once this man goes away, he can no longer remember the poem. So therefore, the poem, he says, is incomplete, a fragment. That is how he uses it, how he describes it in the preface, the following fragment. And he also writes in the preface that he didn't want to publish this poem. He writes the following fragment is here published at the request of a great and deserved celebrity, Lord Byron, and as far as the author's own opinions are concerned, rather as a psychological curiosity than on the ground of any supposed poetic merit. So what he's saying is that I didn't want to publish this poem because I don't think the poem is a good poem, but Lord Byron wanted me to publish it. So I am just publishing it as a kind of a psychological curiosity. Thereby, he is kind of excusing himself from any criticism that may arise as to the nature of the poem. He presents it as a fragment, an incomplete poem. However, the poem is not incomplete. A very important work by Jonathan Livingstone Lewis called The Road to Xanadu shows through a study of the various sources of Kubla Khan the links by which the mind associates the most disparate, distinct elements. In this book, Lewis refers to travel books, to Purchas' Pilgrims and Pilgrimage, to Bruce's Travels to the Source of the River Nile, Morris's History of Hindustan, Bartram's Travels through North and South Carolina, besides works by Herodotus, Strabo, Seneca, Virgil. All of these were writers whose work Coleridge had read. He purposely writes this preface. But this poem is not incomplete. It is a poem about the nature of poetic composition. In the first 36 lines of the poem, opposites are reconciled. Caverns measureless to man, twice 5 miles, sunless seas, sunny spots of greenery, forests and garden, a savage place as holy and enchanted, huge fragments bolted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's pail, sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. The infinite and the finite, darkness and light, wild nature and tamed nature, savagery and holiness, destruction and creation, life and death, all these opposites are brought together into a single design. These opposites of order and disorder result in the unity or reconciliation which Coleridge regarded as imperative for creativity. What he described as the reconciliation of opposites, the coming together of widely disparate ideas. The chief characteristic of the description of the opening landscape that one notices in the poem is that of order. The description of the origin of the river, however, changes the mood of the poem. What we have here, once the river is described, is a contrast to the control and order of the opening lines. The dome of Kubla's palace is a synthesis, the coming together of the tumultuous river and the sunless sea. The first 36 lines of the poem actually relate to what Purkas's pilgrimage talks about. The second part of the poem, the Abyssinian maid with her dulcimer and song, are not present in Purkas's work. The song of this maid, which she plays on her dulcimer, stands for something ideal, stands for something that the poet longs to create. The Abyssinian maid stands for, epitomizes the inspiration which is necessary for poetic creation. The rapture in the final lines of the poem emphasizes the psychological aspect of imagination. What is needed before the poet can reconcile everything to produce the work of art is a psychological harmony, which would reveal joy in the experience. The final image of the poem is that of inspired poetic frenzy. In the poem, we also note descriptions of women. And these women are central to the poem. Coleridge first mentions a woman wailing for a demon lover who is situated in a deep romantic chasm. From this lowered region, she has been condemned to the most intense grief by the absence of a demon lover. Coleridge's rich description of the effect of such grief on the woman is a key to heightening the poem's exotic mood. In the final section of the poem, Coleridge describes an exotic vision of an Abyssinian maid who is playing a dulcimer, singing of Mount Abora, a place which does not exist in the real world. And Coleridge, the poet, expresses a desire to revive the vision to the extent that it could transport him back to the pleasure dome. So Kubla Khan gives us a brief glimpse into an exotic world. It speaks about, gives us wonderful insights into the limits of the great romantic imagination. I move on to talk a little bit of Keats's Ode to Autumn, which expresses an urge to hold on to momentary beauty before its inevitable decline. As a romantic poet, Keats immerses himself in the natural world. He imagines the flowers are still blooming, surrounded with bees in autumn. As he writes, for summer has overbrimmed the clammy cells. The verb brimmed, the adjective clammy, create a vision of prolonged warmth and abundance, as one season leads on to the next. The opening lines emphatically set the tone for the jubilant celebratory tone of the poem and prepares the way for Keats to find excess in a potentially gloomy time of year. It is unusual to read a poet celebrating a misty time of year. Keats describes in the opening verse the productive relationship between autumn and its close bosom friend, the sun. So he is talking about the intimate relationship with nature, that he personifies both the sun and autumn. Autumn is a time when there's not much sun around. Keats's romantic desire for transcendence through communion with nature is highlighted in the use of the word conspiring. The vines and the moss that cover a cottage illustrate nature working with the cottage to support autumn. In the countryside, then, even man-made things, such as the cottage, are intimate with nature, collaborating in the creation of a wonderful illusion, almost like a magic spell, where even the bees will think that, and I quote from the poem, warm days will never cease, by creating later flowers for the bees. He moves on in the second stanza. He shifts the mood by personifying and directly addressing autumn, Autumn is personified, drowsed with the fume of poppies. The soft sounds emphasize a feeling of intoxication, which allows autumn to relax and enjoy its own work. Autumn, we are told, observes the last oozings hours by hours. The oozings of cider being made at the cider press. And its patient look indicates attentiveness and again shows nature in harmony. There is this slow languor, which is, of course, seems to be a kind of a contrast to the aggressive efficiency of the Industrial Revolution. Keats's praise of opium and cider hints at nature's abilities to alleviate pain and offer temporary comfort. While writing this poem in his mid-20s, Keats knew that he was dying from tuberculosis. In what is called his Annus Mirabilis, 1815 to 1816, he wrote some wonderful poems. The Ode to Psyche, Nightingale, Grecian Urn, Autumn. The poem ends with a gentle noise. He hears gnats that are wailful and mourning, full-grown lambs who bleat and who are described as being loud. Other airborne and gentle creatures either sing or whistle or twitter. So it ends with that sense that things are coming to an end, which is very, very, definitely very, very representative of his own physical state at this point of time. Because he knows he has consumption, he knows he's not going to survive any longer. I move on to talk very briefly about the Ode to the West Wind, published in 1820, a passionate invocation to the spirit of the West Wind, which is both destroyer and preserver. Shelley's minute observations of wind, water, cloud, sky bring together imagery which is simultaneously scientific, mythical, biblical, all together. The dominant characteristic of the poem is its attempt to mimic the ebb and flow of the wind. This poem relies on the traditional address to the specific audience, but the audience within the poem exists in the imagination. The ode is a classical form of poem. And during the 18th century, it was usually associated with the Old Testament and biblical prophecy. And this ode to the West Wind, begins with an invocation to a divine presence within nature. Although the poem describes the autumnal wind, the power of the wind is connected to the divine power. And the destruction in nature comes as the seeds of a future spring are set forth, a new life about to begin. After focusing on how the wind affects the land, the narrator begins to discuss the sky. The second stanza of the poem describes the creation of clouds, the fractostratus, the cirrus clouds. The clouds, as the poem explains, are approaching with rain, and the process by which they are made is through the coming together of water vapor from the water, ocean with wind from the sky, heaven, everything working together. In the third stanza, the wind affects the sea and the underwater vegetation. As the poem continues, night is compared to a sepulchre, while nature is described in its destructive terms, and the wind destroys all that is part of the old state of things, regardless of its benefit or harm. The fourth stanza talks about the destruction. The fifth, of course, talks about the narrator's desire to merge with the wind. And the narrator concludes, the speaker concludes in the fifth stanza in a melancholic tone. The poem brings in a lot of reference to revolution, but the poem is also a very, very personal poem. This poem Shelley writes, was conceived and chiefly written in a wood that skirts the Arno near Florence, and on a day when the tempestuous wind, whose temperature is at once mild and animating, was collecting the vapors which pour down the autumnal rains. They began, as I foresaw, at sunset with a violent tempest of hail and rain, attended by that magnificent thunder and lightning peculiar to the Cisalpine regions. The phenomena which is referred to in the third stanza is well known to naturalists. The vegetation at the bottom of the sea, of rivers, of lakes, which sympathizes with that of the land in the change of the season, and consequently of the wind which announces it. The poem, as I said, speaks about revolution, but is also a very personal poem. You know, the winter, the season, brings in his personal sorrow. Spring represents the sorrow's end. The poem also contains lines related to the death of his daughter, Clara, and the kind of impact it had on his family. However, the seasons of fall and winter are directly referred to the time after the end of the French Revolution, with a reference to aspects of nature which relate to the possibility of a future liberty that will bring about a new age for mankind. So together, the personal and the historical outlook of the poem contains Shelley's personal interest in using his poetry to bring about a better future. I would like to end by referring to this poem. All of us know it as a nursery rhyme, but these are actually lines from a romantic poem. These lines that you see right now are one of the world's most popular nursery rhymes. That these lines are part of a romantic poem is a much lesser known fact. Written by Jane Taylor, 1783 to 1824, the lines are part of an early 19th century English poem called The Star. The poem, written in couplets, was first published in 1806 in Rhymes of the Nursery, a collection of poems for children by Jane Taylor and her sister Anne Taylor. This poem, The Star, is located both indoors and outdoors. The star shining in the sky also peeps into the house through the curtain. The voice heard in the poem is that of a mother, of a nurse or a carer, who looks after the child and lulls the child to bed. The child in the star is charmed by the calming, soothing voice all around. The presence of the child associates this poet, links this poet with many other poems written in the Romantic period, where the figure of the child features so very prominently. For example, in William Wordsworth's Immortality Ode and Lucy Gray in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, among others. One of the major achievements of Romantic literature, of Romantic poetry, is that it opened up new vistas and avenues of truth. The individual assumed utmost importance, and imagination became the focal point from which the individual was able to perceive and create art. Imagination, according to Coleridge, is the very soul of poetry. Almost all the Romantic poets had something to say on this primal faculty. However much they differed in their interpretations of it, all of them stressed on its unifying creative nature. Imagination for the Romantics was a way of accessing and reaching out to the truth, a means of creating order out of disorder. Romanticism, of course, as I said, as I began by talking, that it is a branch of thought, and it is not something restricted just to poetry or literature, but it was seen in the political, social, religious, and psychological areas of thought as well. It was a widespread phenomenon which involved all spheres of human activity. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your erudite lecture. May I request the participants, if you have any questions, you can please type in the chat box, so you can raise your hand. I will unmute you. Any questions from the participants, please? No questions? You can directly raise the hand. Yeah, we all enjoyed ma'am's lecture. Thank you for that. Thank you for the encouraging words. I'm sure Nishi ma'am as well is going through the chat box. It was indeed a very informative lecture. So may I request participants, no doubt at all. You can raise your hand too if you are finding it difficult to type in the chat box. Monica Gupta writes that it was a totally new concept of knowing the scientific aspects of romantic poets, which is beyond imagination. Yes, I agree. There were some very ma'am, as you know, we have students from graduation and masters as well. So I think you have muted yourself. I'll just unmute you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for all those comments. Yes, I purposely brought in the idea of science because, you know, when we think of romanticism, we think of it as something only to do with imagination and beyond the real, but actually they were very much rooted with the various developments that were happening at the time, and which is why I brought in science, because in many of these poets, for instance, in Shelley's poem as well, you find a lot of reference to science and scientific phenomena. I just referred to a few of them, but we find that in most of their poems. So science was something, you know, which was, you know, bringing out so much of the unknown, things that nobody knew ever existed. You know, that lightning could be the source of electricity was something that nobody knew. Right, so lightning has always been there. It's not as if lightning is something new. It was always been there, part of nature. Everybody knew about it. But the fact that it could be a source of electricity. So in other words, there's so much of the unknown in the world that one inhabits. And that is something which brings in this element of wonder, which is so much a part of romantic poetry. So they found all interest in almost every aspect of science, you know, whether it's chemistry, whether it's geography, whether it is geology, right? And, you know, they speak about, I didn't refer to this, but I would like to speak about it here. You know, Coleridge in one place speaks about the human mind as a kind of a chemical laboratory. What happens in a chemical laboratory? What happens in a lab? In an experiment, you use different elements, right? So hydrogen, a molecule of hydrogen and 2 molecules of oxygen gives you water, right? So 2 gases give you a liquid. And he uses this to describe the poet's mind, the poet's imagination. Because into the poet's mind come various expressions, various thoughts, various images. Right? He sees so much around him. He's reading, he's experiencing, he's observing. And all of this is working in his mind in different ways. We don't even know how it's working. And when he presents that in his poem, when he describes that in his poem, the end product is so very different from the constituent elements, exactly in the same way as 1 molecule of hydrogen and 2 molecules of oxygen give you water. And Coleridge uses this example to talk about this idea of a chemical laboratory, the human mind as a chemical laboratory. Fancy and imagination is like this. See, fancy is you look out of the window and you see something. You see a cat sitting on the wall, or a cat looking up at a bird on a tree, and you tell that to someone else. That is just fancy out there. Okay. When, for instance, when you go out on a holiday and you enjoy your holiday a lot, and then you come back and you have to write an essay, or you have to describe to your friends about the experiences that you had when you were out on this holiday. So when you are experiencing, when you are describing it, what are you doing? You are not only telling what you did, where you went, but you are trying to also bring in your perceptions, the kind of feelings that may have come into your mind when you experienced it the first time. You will try to do it. That is imagination. That is primary imagination, basically. Secondary imagination is the poetic imagination. It is that faculty where you bring all these various ideas together and present it in such a form. I'll give you one example which I use very often, and this is the poem by William Wordsworth. I forget the name of the poem. What is a very famous poem? The one where he's pensive, Daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Yes, everybody understand. The moment I told it, you understand the poem. It is one poem that remains with you. Right. And what is he talking about? What he's talking about is something each of us in some way or the other have experienced. You know, you go to some place and you see something and it remains with you. Right. But when he's writing about it, he's not only talking about the daffodils, he's not only talking about his observation of this beautiful scenery, he's not only describing the scenery, but he's also saying that at a point of time when I'm completely alone, when I'm melancholic, when I'm in a very pensive mood, all I have to do is think about that field of daffodils dancing in the sun, and then I am no longer sad. And so what he's doing is he's bringing that image of the daffodils together with this feeling, which we might not have thought of bringing together. And they're said in such simple lines that it remains with you. And when you read the lines, you feel, this is exactly what I feel. This is exactly what happens to me. When I am in a sad, pensive mood, all I have to do is think about something nice, and that makes me feel nice. But you see, when I will be explaining a field of daffodils, I will just be describing the field of daffodils. I will not be linking it up to something else. This ability of being able to link it up with something else is what is secondary imagination. The ability to bring very diverse, disjointed, disparate, dissimilar objects, to bring it together, to transform it completely so that the end product is so very different from the sense impressions which have gone into it. That is what imagination is. That is what distinguishes a poet from an ordinary person. Because the poet is able to bring these widely different ideas, which we don't even think. You see, when you are depicting such a beautiful field of daffodils, why will you ever think of sadness? You won't. You will just describe that field. But here he brings in that idea of the sadness. And that also is such a universal feeling. When you read it, you think he's writing exactly what I feel. So he's able to kind of, bring these diverse things. That is what the secondary imagination, or what is the poetic imagination all about, which differentiates the poet from an ordinary person. Have I made it clear?
Absolutely. That's the best way to explain, I guess, fancy and imagination. And what better way than giving examples from the literature itself? and you being a poet expressed it in a very very layman's language. And I really envy the students here who are doing their graduation and all, that they are getting an opportunity to clarify their doubts in such a manner, which was a luxury for all of us during our days. Thank you so much, ma'am. On behalf of Team DAATH Voyage, it's always a pleasure and honor to have you, and thank you for taking our platform so seriously and giving it the due attention. It is people like you all who, your hard work, who has given a recognition to our platform, and that's the reason why we are running the 14th lecture series back to back in the last 14 months, I guess 13 months. So look forward again to have you on this platform, and thank you always for your support and generosity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Please take care, ma'am. Good night.
Good night.